I think the best explanation for why this war started and why this war is progressing the way it is a lethal, toxic combination of both hubris and desperation. So let me take some time to explain what I mean, okay? So the very premise of the American Empire is something called the Mackinder Heartland thesis. And this was actually something that the British developed, okay? So the British was an island. It had a very low population. And for it to control the world, it had to control the seas. So it built the world's greatest navy. And it made sure that this navy was the most dominant in the world. And in fact, they designed the navy to be able to defeat the next two great naval powers combined. And so with a navy is useless against a land power. And so the great fear of the British imperialists is that a great power would emerge in the Eurasian heartland, okay? So basically Europe and Asia. And at this time, there were several candidates that could have emerged, and we're talking about the 18th century, by the way, that could have emerged to unify the Eurasian heartland and create this continental trade system that would negate British naval power, okay? So the candidates were the Ottoman Empire, the French, the Germans, and the Russians, these four great powers. And that's what led ultimately to the Napoleonic Wars, okay? 7 wars fought between France and the British and their allies. And you can actually see the Napoleonic Wars as ultimately an economic trade war, in that Napoleon wanted to create a continental trade system, and the British refused to let him do so because that would mean the collapse of the British economy. And so the British basically had an infinite printing machine called the Bank of England. They financed Europe to fight against Napoleon 7 times. And they lost 6 times, but ultimately they won. And they had no choice, because the British economy, like the American economy, is essentially a Ponzi scheme. And so they had to keep on financing until they beat Napoleon. After Napoleon was defeated, Britain became the global hegemon, and then it focused its attention on trying to divide and conquer Germany and Russia. So in the 19th century, Britain engaged in something called the Great Game with Russia, where they fought for Central Asia. Because again, Britain cannot afford for Russia to unify the heartland, because if Russia did that, it could build a railroad system so that all trade could just happen within the continent, and then extend to Africa as well as the Middle East. And then, of course, in the 20th century, Britain and Germany fought 2 great wars, and America came in to save Britain in the end and prevent Germany from unifying the heartland. Okay, so that's the main idea behind the American Empire, and it's still true today. And after the Soviet Union fell, America had this unipolar moment where it could extend its empire throughout the world. And this empire came to an end actually in 2022 when Putin invaded Ukraine. And with Russia essentially winning this war in Ukraine, there's a great fear that Russia, Iran, and China would come together as partners in BRICS, and then they could unify the heartland economically, and then extend to Europe, Middle East, and Africa, basically BRICS plus. And then they could just dump the US dollar. And right now the United States is sitting on $40 trillion in debt. And it's a Ponzi scheme, so if other nations stop buying US dollars, then America would be left holding the bag. And then the bomb would explode in their face, the American economy would collapse, and you would see a revolution on the streets in America. So in other words, America didn't really have a choice but to prevent Iran, Russia, and China from forming a heartland alliance. Now, the problem with an empire is that once you become desperate, you make silly decisions. And the reason why is hubris, okay? The belief that you're invincible. And America developed hubris primarily because for the past 20 years, America could do whatever it wanted in the Middle East. So in 2003, it took America exactly 2 weeks to steamroll over Iraq. And they did it so with very little casualties, and they did so with massive political support in the United States. And so America just believed it was invincible. And this sense of inevitability and invincibility cemented itself throughout the Middle East, because America, even though it caused a lot of havoc and destruction, it was still triumphant in Libya, in Syria, throughout the Middle East, basically. And so from their perspective, what's the difference between, Iraq and Iran, right? Same name, just one other difference. And so that's the idea of hubris. And this hubris basically blinded Donald Trump with arrogance in Venezuela. Because remember, back in January 3rd, Delta Force swept into Caracas and basically kidnapped Maduro and there was no American casualty. It was a miracle of the American military. It was almost like as though God willed it. And so that made Trump extremely arrogant, and that probably convinced him that he could do anything he wanted because he had the most powerful military in the world. And so, so he basically ordered the invasion, the attack on Iran, believing that the decapitation strike in the first day would cause the regime to collapse because it was so hated by the people. Remember, in January, there were also these protests in Iran. So it was a severe miscalculation, and it was caused by, again, a lethal combination of both hubris and desperation. Hubris in that the empire thought it was invincible, desperation in that it had no choice in the matter but to start this war in order to maintain its hegemony throughout the world.